The pressing need following the death of Julian was to select an emperor worthy enough not just to succeed such a figure, but also to succeed in the war against the Persians. The tribune Jovian, a soldier general who Gibbon relates indulged his taste for wine and women and yet supported with credit the character of a Christian and a soldier, was chosen. Jovian's reign was brief, between AD 363 and AD 364, during which he accepted a humiliating peace with Sapor, monarch of Persia, ceding to the Persians 5 provinces, including several citadels of impregnable strength.
It was considered as an indulgence that the inhabitants of those fortresses were permitted to retire with their effects. But the conqueror rigorously insisted that the Romans should forever abandon the king and kingdom of Armenia. A peace, or rather a long truce of 30 years, was stipulated between the hostile nations. The faith of the treaty was ratified by solemn oaths and religious ceremonies, and hostages of distinguished rank were reciprocally delivered to secure the performance of the conditions. Sapor enjoyed the glory and the fruits of his victory, and this ignominious peace has justly been considered as a memorable era in the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The predecessors of Jovian had sometimes relinquished the dominion of distant and unprofitable provinces. But since the foundation of the city, the genius of Rome, the god Terminus, who guarded the boundaries of the Republic, had never retired before the sword of a victorious enemy. After Jovian had performed those engagements which the voice of his people might have tempted him to violate, he hastened away from the scene of his disgrace and proceeded with his whole court to enjoy the luxury of Antioch. The slightest force, when it is applied to assist and guide the natural descent of its object, operates with irresistible weight. And Jovian had the good fortune to embrace the religious opinions which were supported by the spirit of the times and the zeal and numbers of the most powerful sect. Under his reign, Christianity obtained an easy and lasting victory, and as soon as the smile of royal patronage was withdrawn, the genius of paganism, which had been fondly raised and cherished by the arts of Julian, sunk irrecoverably in the dust. In many cities the temples were shut or deserted. The philosophers, who had abused their transient favour, thought it prudent to shave their beards and disguise their profession. And the Christians rejoiced that they were now in a condition to forgive or to revenge the injuries which they had suffered under the preceding reign.
Jovian's short-lived reign ended in mysterious fashion. Gibbon relates that,
after indulging himself with a plentiful, perhaps an intemperate supper, he retired to rest, and the next morning the Emperor Jovian was found dead in his bed. The cause of this sudden death was variously understood. By some it was ascribed to the consequences of an indigestion, occasioned either by the quantity of the wine or the quality of the mushrooms which he had swallowed in the evening. According to others, he was suffocated in his sleep by the vapour of charcoal which extracted from the walls of the apartment the unwholesome moisture of the fresh plaster. But the want of a regular inquiry into the death of a prince, whose reign and person were soon forgotten, appears to have been the only circumstance which countenanced the malicious whispers of poison and domestic guilt.
following the death of Jovian, the purple mantle fell to Valentinian, a soldier who rapidly elevated his brother Valens to the title of Augustus, dividing the empire once more into west and east, with Valentinian ruling the west from AD 364 to AD 375, and Valens the east between AD 364 and AD 378.
When this important business had been amicably transacted, Valentinian and Valens embraced for the last time. The Emperor of the West established his temporary residence at Milan, and the Emperor of the East returned to Constantinople to assume the dominion of 50 provinces, of whose language he was totally ignorant. The most honourable circumstance of the character of Valentinian is the firm and temperate impartiality which he uniformly preserved in an age of religious contention. His strong sense, unenlightened but uncorrupted by study, declined with respectful indifference the subtle questions of theological debate. The government of the earth claimed his vigilance and satisfied his ambition. and while he remembered that he was the disciple of the Church, he never forgot that he was the sovereign of the clergy. Under the reign of an apostate, he had signalized his zeal for the honour of Christianity. He allowed to his subjects the privilege which he had assumed for himself, and they might accept with gratitude and confidence the general toleration which was granted by a prince addicted to passion, but incapable of fear or of disguise. The pagans, the Jews, and all the various sects which acknowledged the divine authority of Christ were protected by the laws from arbitrary power or popular insult. Nor was any mode of worship prohibited by Valentinian, except those secret and criminal practices which abused the name of religion for the dark purposes of vice and disorder. The art of magic, as it was more cruelly punished, was more strictly proscribed. But the emperor admitted a formal distinction to protect the ancient methods of divination, which were approved by the Senate and exercised by the Tuscan haruspices. He had condemned, with the consent of the most rational pagans, the license of nocturnal sacrifices. But he immediately admitted the petition of Praetextatus, proconsul of Achaia, who represented that the life of the Greeks would become dreary and comfortless if they were deprived of the invaluable blessing of the Eleusinian mysteries. Philosophy alone can boast, and perhaps it is no more than the boast of philosophy, that her gentle hand is able to eradicate from the human mind the latent and deadly principle of fanaticism. But this truce of 12 years, which was enforced by the wise and vigorous government of Valentinian, by suspending the repetition of mutual injuries, contributed to soften the manners and abate the prejudices of the religious factions.
The weak and feeble Valens was quickly challenged by a tribune named Procopius, who was related to the former emperor Julian. For a short time, confusingly enough, Procopius was even acclaimed emperor between AD 365 and AD 366 in Constantinople. He was equally rapidly deserted by his supporters, captured by troops loyal to Valens, and unceremoniously beheaded.
We should turn with horror from the frequent executions which disgraced, both at Rome and Antioch, the reign of the two brothers. Valens was of a timid and Valentinian of a choleric disposition. An anxious regard to his personal safety was the ruling principle of the administration of Valens. The favourites of Valens obtained, by the privilege of rapine and confiscation, the wealth which his economy would have refused. They urged with persuasive eloquence that in all cases of treason, suspicion is equivalent to proof, that the power supposes the intention of mischief, that the intention is not less criminal than the act, and that a subject no longer deserves to live if his life may threaten the safety or disturb the repose of his sovereign. Valentinian was seldom injured and never insulted with impunity. If his prudence was arraigned, his spirit was applauded, and the proudest and most powerful generals were apprehensive of provoking the resentment of a fearless soldier. After he became master of the world, he unfortunately forgot that, where no resistance can be made, no courage can be exerted, and instead of consulting the dictates of reason and magnanimity, he indulged the furious emotions of his temper at a time when they were disgraceful to himself and fatal to the defenceless objects of his displeasure. In the government of his household or of his empire, slight or even imaginary offences, a hasty word, a casual omission, an involuntary delay, were chastised by a sentence of immediate death. The expressions which issued the most readily from the mouth of the Emperor of the West were, "Strike off his head, burn him alive, let him be beaten with clubs till he expires." And his most favoured ministers soon understood that by a rash attempt to dispute or suspend the execution of his sanguinary commands, they might involve themselves in the guilt and punishment of disobedience. The repeated gratification of this savage justice hardened the mind of Valentinian against pity and remorse, and the sallies of passion were confirmed by the habits of cruelty. He could behold with calm satisfaction the convulsive agonies of torture and death. Two fierce and enormous bears, distinguished by the appellations of Innocence and Mica Aurea, were always placed near the bedchamber of Valentinian, who frequently amused his eyes with the grateful spectacle of seeing them tear and devour the bleeding limbs of the malefactors who were abandoned to their rage. Their diet and exercises were carefully inspected by the Roman emperor, and when Innocence had earned her discharge by a long course of meritorious service, the faithful animal was again restored to the freedom of her native woods.
Despite the personal cruelty of Valentinian, Gibbon praises this emperor for ushering in a period of religious toleration, for his condemnation of the practice of exposing newborn infants to the elements, and for establishing an educational institute in each major city of the empire. But despite a relatively lengthy period of internal tranquility, the empires of both the West and East were subject to constant threats from the barbarians of Britain, Africa, Germany, and in Asia. Valentinian died in an apoplectic rage at the age of 54, receiving the ambassadors of a Germanic tribe who were seeking his clemency. Valentinian's son Gratian was ratified as new emperor of the West in AD 375, but not without opposition. For Valentinian had 2 wives, and the second, Justina, claimed the purple for her son by Valentinian, who was also called Valentinian.
On the 6th day after the death of Valentinian, the infant prince of the same name, who was only 4 years old, was shown in the arms of his mother to the legions, and solemnly invested by military acclamation with the titles and ensigns of supreme power. The impending dangers of a civil war were seasonably prevented by the wise and moderate conduct of the Emperor Gratian. He cheerfully accepted the choice of the army, declared that he should always consider the son of Justina as a brother, not as a rival, and advised the empress with her son Valentinian to fix their residence at Milan, in the fair and peaceful province of Italy, while he assumed the more arduous command of the countries beyond the Alps. Gratian dissembled his resentment till he could safely punish or disgrace the authors of the conspiracy. And though he uniformly behaved with tenderness and regard to his infant colleague, he gradually confounded, in the administration of the Western Empire, the office of a guardian with the authority of a sovereign. The government of the Roman world was exercised in the united names of Valens and his 2 nephews. But the feeble emperor of the East, who succeeded to the rank of his elder brother, never obtained any weight or influence in the councils of the West.
In the final pages of his history, Gibbon writes that he has described the triumph of barbarism and religion. In the 100 years between the reign of Gratian in AD 375 and that of Romulus Augustulus, the final emperor of the West from AD 475 to AD 476, Rome was twice sacked by barbarian invaders, first by Alaric the Goth, then by Genseric the Vandal, till at last Rome was ruled by Odoacer, first barbarian king of Italy. In these final extracts from the 3rd volume of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, we learn how the empire of the West was humbled by those it once ruled without mercy. Following the death of Valentinian, Valens was beset by fresh problems. North of the Danube, a new savage barbarian tribe known as the Huns had subverted the power of the Goths, who had been brought to heel by Valens. The Goths begged to be permitted to occupy land around Thrace to escape the Huns. Valens agreed.
The prayers of the Goths were granted, and their service was accepted by the imperial court, and orders were immediately dispatched by the civil and military governors of the Thracian diocese to make the necessary preparations for the passage and subsistence of a great people, till a proper and sufficient territory could be allotted for their future residence. The liberality of the emperor was accompanied, however, with two harsh and rigorous conditions, which prudence might justify on the side of the Romans, but which distress alone could extort from the indignant Goths. Before they passed the Danube, they were required to deliver their arms, and it was insisted that their children should be taken from them and dispersed through the provinces of Asia, where they might be civilized by the arts of education and serve as hostages to secure the fidelity of their parents. The children of the Goths, those at least of a distinguished rank, were separated from the multitude. They were conducted without delay to the distant seats assigned for their residence and education. And as the numerous train of hostages or captives passed through the cities, their gay and splendid apparel, their robust and martial figure, excited the surprise and envy of the provincials. But the stipulation most offensive to the Goths and most important to the Romans was shamefully eluded. The barbarians, who considered their arms as the ensigns of honor and the pledges of safety, were disposed to offer a price which the lust or avarice of the imperial officers was easily tempted to accept. To preserve their arms, the haughty warriors consented with some reluctance to prostitute their wives or their daughters. The charms of a beauteous maid or a comely boy secured the connivance of the inspectors, who sometimes cast an eye of covetousness on the fringed carpets and linen garments of their new allies, or who sacrificed their duty to the mean consideration of filling their farms with cattle and their houses with slaves. The Goths, with arms in their hands, were permitted to enter the boats, and when their strength was collected on the other side of the river, the immense camp which was spread over the plains and the hills of the Lower Mysia assumed a threatening and even hostile aspect.
It was not long before the Goths and Roman soldiers clashed, but the victory went to the barbarians, who broke the Roman legions.
That successful day put an end to the distress of the barbarians and the security of the Romans. From that day the Goths, renouncing the precarious condition of strangers and exiles, assumed the character of citizens and masters, claimed an absolute dominion over the possessors of land, and held in their own right the northern provinces of the empire, which are bounded by the Danube. Such are the words of the Gothic historian, who celebrates with rude eloquence the glory of his countrymen. But the dominion of the barbarians was exercised only for the purposes of rapine and destruction. As they had been deprived by the ministers of the emperor of the common benefits of nature and the fair intercourse of social life, they retaliated the injustice on the subjects of the empire.
Valens marched from Antioch to Thrace to put down this rebellion led by Fritigern, one of the joint leaders of the Visigoths.
While the trumpets sounded to arms, the undaunted courage of the Goths was confirmed by the mutual obligation of a solemn oath. And as they advanced to meet the enemy, the rude songs which celebrated the glory of their forefathers were mingled with their fierce and dissonant outcries and opposed to the artificial harmony of the Roman shout. Some military skill was displayed by Fritigern to gain the advantage of a commanding eminence. But the bloody conflict, which began and ended with a light, was maintained on either side by the personal and obstinate efforts of strength, valor, and agility. The legions of Armenia supported their fame in arms, but they were oppressed by the irresistible weight of the hostile multitude. The left wing of the Romans was thrown into disorder, and the field was strewed with their mangled carcasses. This partial defeat was balanced, however, by partial success, and when the two armies at a late hour of the evening retreated to their respective camps, neither of them could claim the honors or the effects of a decisive victory. The real loss was more severely felt by the Romans in proportion to the smallness of their numbers. But the Goths were so deeply confounded and dismayed by this vigorous and perhaps unexpected resistance that they remained 7 days within the circle of their fortifications. Such funeral rites, as the circumstances of time and place would admit, were piously discharged to some officers of distinguished rank. But the indiscriminate vulgar were left unburied on the plain. Their flesh was greedily devoured by the birds of prey, who in that age enjoyed very frequent and delicious feasts. And several years afterwards, the white and naked bones which covered the wide extent of the fields presented to the eyes a dreadful monument of the Battle of Salices. On the 9th of August, a day which has deserved to be marked among the most inauspicious of the Roman calendar, the Emperor Valens, leaving under a strong guard his baggage and military treasure, marched from Hadrianople to attack the Goths, who were encamped about 12 miles from the city. By some mistake of the orders or some ignorance of the ground, the right wing or column of cavalry arrived in sight of the enemy, whilst the left was still at a considerable distance. The soldiers were compelled, in the sultry heat of summer, to precipitate their pace, and the line of battle was formed with tedious confusion and irregular delay. The Gothic cavalry had been detached to forage in the adjacent country, and Fritigern still continued to practice his customary arts. He dispatched messengers of peace, made proposals, required hostages, and wasted the hours till the Romans, exposed without shelter to the burning rays of the sun, were exhausted by thirst, hunger, and intolerable fatigue. The emperor was persuaded to send an ambassador to the Gothic camp. The zeal of Ricomer, who alone had courage to accept the dangerous commission, was applauded, and the Count of the Domestics, adorned with the splendid ensigns of his dignity, had proceeded some way in the space between the two armies, when he was suddenly recalled by the alarm of battle. The hasty and imprudent attack was made by Bacurius the Iberian, who commanded a body of archers and targeteers, and as they advanced with rashness, they retreated with loss and disgrace. In the same moment, the flying squadrons of Alatheus and Saphrax, whose return was anxiously expected by the general of the Goths, descended like a whirlwind from the hills, swept across the plain, and added new terrors to the tumultuous but irresistible charge of the barbarian host. The event of the Battle of Hadrianople, so fatal to Valens and to the emperor, may be described in a few words. The Roman cavalry fled. The infantry was abandoned, surrounded, and cut in pieces. The most skilful evolutions, the firmest courage, are scarcely sufficient to extricate a body of foot encompassed on an open plain by superior numbers of horse. But the troops of Valens, oppressed by the weight of the enemy and their own fears, were crowded into a narrow space where it was impossible for them to extend their ranks or even to use with effect their swords and javelins. In the midst of tumult, of slaughter, and of dismay, the emperor, deserted by his guards and wounded, as it was supposed, with an arrow, sought protection among the Lancearii and the Mattiarii, who still maintained their ground with some appearance of order and firmness. His faithful generals, Trajan and Victor, who perceived his danger, loudly exclaimed that all was lost unless the person of the emperor could be saved. Some troops, animated by their exhortation, advanced to his relief. They found only a bloody spot, covered with a heap of broken arms and mangled bodies, without being able to discover their unfortunate prince either among the living or the dead. Their search could not indeed be successful, if there is any truth in the circumstances with which some historians have related the death of the emperor. By the care of his attendants, Valens was removed from the field of battle to a neighboring cottage, where they attempted to dress his wound.
But this humble retreat was instantly surrounded by the enemy. They tried to force the door. They were provoked by a discharge of arrows from the roof, till at length, impatient of delay, they set fire to a pile of faggots and consumed the cottage with the Roman emperor and his train. Valens perished in the flames. A great number of brave and distinguished officers perished in the Battle of Hadrianople. Above 2/3 of the Roman army were destroyed. Gratian bestowed the title of Emperor of the East on Theodosius, son of a soldier general who had served valiantly the Emperor Valentinian. Theodosius reigned between AD 379 and AD 395, and quickly moved to revenge the defeat of Valens at Hadrianople by curtailing, though not extirpating, the Gothic rebellions. Theodosius prudently sought a modus vivendi with the Goths, and finally enlisted a major portion of that tribe into the Roman legion's ranks.
The submission of so great a body of the Visigoths was productive of the most salutary consequences, and the mixed influence of force, of reason, and of corruption became every day more powerful and more extensive. Each independent chieftain hastened to obtain a separate treaty, from the apprehension that an obstinate delay might expose him, alone and unprotected, to the revenge or justice of the conqueror. The general, or rather the final, capitulation of the Goths may be dated 4 years, 1 month, and 25 days after the defeat and death of the Emperor Valens. It was apparent to every discerning eye that the Goths would long remain the enemies and might soon become the conquerors of the Roman Empire. Their rude and insolent behavior expressed their contempt of the citizens and provincials whom they insulted with impunity. To the zeal and valor of the barbarians, Theodosius was indebted for the success of his arms. But their assistance was precarious, and they were sometimes seduced by a treacherous and inconstant disposition to abandon his standard at the moment when their service was the most essential. It was generally believed that the Goths had signed the treaty of peace with an hostile and insidious spirit, and that their chiefs had previously bound themselves by a solemn and secret oath never to keep faith with the Romans, but to maintain the fairest show of loyalty and friendship, and to watch the favorable moment of rapine, of conquest, and of revenge.
Gratian still reigned as Emperor of the West, but a revolt in Britain, led by the soldier Maximus, spilled over into Gaul, disturbing the tranquillity of Gratian's residence in Paris. Gratian's troops deserted him. He fled to Lyon, where he was assassinated by an emissary of Maximus. Maximus sued for peace with Theodosius, who agreed, on condition that he content himself with possession of those territories west of the Alps. Theodosius, meanwhile, concentrated on consolidating his authority in the east, and became the first of the emperors to be baptized a Christian. Not content with the possession of much of West Europe, Maximus eventually marched against Theodosius, but was defeated and slain, leaving Theodosius in sole command of the Roman world. Gratian's younger brother Valentinian was confirmed as Emperor of the West, but quickly lost power to an ambitious general called Arbogastes, a Frank who commanded the armies of Gaul. Valentinian was found strangled after an argument with Arbogastes, who offered the purple robes of emperor to an associate named Eugenius. Theodosius again put down this usurpation, only to die a short while afterwards in AD 395. He left the empire to his 2 weak young sons, Arcadius, Emperor of the East, and Honorius of the West.
The genius of Rome expired with Theodosius, the last of the successors of Augustus and Constantine, who appeared in the field at the head of their armies, and whose authority was universally acknowledged throughout the whole extent of the empire. The memory of his virtue still continued, however, to protect the feeble and inexperienced youth of his 2 sons. After the death of their father, Arcadius and Honorius were saluted by the unanimous consent of mankind as the lawful emperors of the East and of the West, and the oath of fidelity was eagerly taken by every order of the state, the senates of old and new Rome, the clergy, the magistrates, the soldiers, and the people. Arcadius, who then was about 18 years of age, was born in Spain in the humble habitation of a private family, but he received a princely education in the palace of Constantinople, and his inglorious life was spent in that peaceful and splendid seat of royalty, from whence he appeared to reign over the provinces of Thrace, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, from the lower Danube to the confines of Persia and Ethiopia. His younger brother Honorius assumed in the 11th year of his age the nominal government of Italy, Africa, Gaul, Spain, and Britain, and the troops which guarded the frontiers of his kingdom were opposed on one side to the Caledonians and on the other to the Moors.
But the two youths were most inadequate successors to Theodosius. Arcadius spent much of his time plotting the assassination of the one impressive figure of the period, the military commander Stilicho, to whom Theodosius had entrusted the care of both the Republic and his sons. Of Honorius, Gibbon notes that he passed the slumber of his life, a captive in his palace, a stranger in his country, and the patient, almost indifferent spectator of the ruin of the Western Empire.
If the subjects of Rome could be ignorant of their obligations to the great Theodosius, they were too soon convinced how painfully the spirit and abilities of their deceased emperor had supported the frail and mouldering edifice of the Republic. He died in the month of January, and before the end of the winter of the same year, the Gothic nation was in arms. The barbarian auxiliaries erected their independent standard and boldly avowed the hostile designs which they had long cherished in their ferocious minds. Their countrymen, who had been condemned by the conditions of the last treaty to a life of tranquillity and labour, deserted their farms at the first sound of the trumpet and eagerly resumed the weapons which they had reluctantly laid down. The barriers of the Danube were thrown open, the savage warriors of Scythia issued from their forests, and the uncommon severity of the winter allowed the poet to remark that they rolled their ponderous wagons over the broad and icy back of the indignant river.
The Goths, led by the bold and artful genius of Alaric, who had sought the leadership of the Roman legions, marched into Greece, taking Athens without a fight. Alaric, king of the Visigoths, threatened the survival of the Republic.
As soon as the Athenians heard the voice of the Gothic herald, they were easily persuaded to deliver the greatest part of their wealth as the ransom of the city of Minerva and its inhabitants. The treaty was ratified by solemn oaths and observed with mutual fidelity. The Gothic prince, with a small and select train, was admitted within the walls. He indulged himself in the refreshment of the bath, accepted a splendid banquet which was provided by the magistrate, and affected to show that he was not ignorant of the manners of civilized nations. But the whole territory of Attica, from the promontory of Sunium to the town of Megara, was blasted by his baleful presence. And if we may use the comparison of a contemporary philosopher, Athens itself resembled the bleeding and empty skin of a slaughtered victim. While the downfall of the barbarians was the topic of popular conversation, an edict was published at Constantinople which declared the promotion of Alaric to the rank of Master General of the Eastern Illyricum. The Roman provincials and the allies who had respected the faith of treaties were justly indignant that the ruin of Greece and Epirus should be so liberally rewarded. The Gothic conqueror was received as a lawful magistrate in the cities which he had so lately besieged. The fathers whose sons he had massacred, the husbands whose wives he had violated, were subject to his authority, and the success of his rebellion encouraged the ambition of every leader of the foreign mercenaries. The use to which Alaric applied his new command distinguished the firm and judicious character of his policy. He issued his orders to the 4 magazines and manufactures of offensive and defensive arms, Margus, Ratiaria, Nisus, and Thessalonica, to provide his troops with an extraordinary supply of shields, helmets, swords, and spears. The unhappy provincials were compelled to forge the instruments of their own destruction, and the barbarians removed the only defect which had sometimes disappointed the efforts of their courage.
Gibbon writes that the Emperor Honorius was distinguished above his subjects by the preeminence of fear as well as rank. As Alaric approached Milan,
Honorius, accompanied by a feeble train of statesmen and eunuchs, hastily retreated towards the Alps, with the design of securing his person in the city of Arles, which had often been the royal residence of his predecessors. But Honorius had scarcely passed the Po before he was overtaken by the speed of the Gothic cavalry. The urgency of the danger compelled him to seek a temporary shelter within the fortification of Asta, a town of Liguria or Piedmont, situate on the banks of the Tanaris. The siege of an obscure place, which contained so rich a prize and seemed incapable of a long resistance, was instantly formed and indefatigably pressed by the king of the Goths. and the bold declaration, which the emperor might afterwards make, that his breast had never been susceptible of fear, did not probably obtain much credit, even in his own court. In the last and almost hopeless extremity, after the barbarians had already proposed the indignity of a capitulation, the imperial captive was suddenly relieved by the fame, the approach, and at length the presence of the hero whom he had so long expected. At the head of a chosen and intrepid vanguard, Stilicho swam the stream of the Adour to gain the time which he must have lost in the attack of the bridge. The passage of the Po was an enterprise of much less hazard and difficulty, and the successful action in which he cut his way through the Gothic camp under the walls of Asta revived the hopes and vindicated the honour of Rome.
Alaric signalled a retreat, but Stilicho attacked these Christian barbarians at Pollentia as they were celebrating Easter. Stilicho was victorious.
The skill of the general and the bravery of the soldiers surmounted every obstacle. In the evening of the bloody day, the Goths retreated from the field of battle. The entrenchments of their camp were forced, and the scene of rapine and slaughter made some atonement for the calamities which they had inflicted on the subjects of the empire. The magnificent spoils of Corinth and Argos enriched the veterans of the West. The captive wife of Alaric, who had impatiently claimed his promise of Roman jewels and patrician handmaids, was reduced to implore the mercy of the insulting foe, and many thousand prisoners, released from the Gothic chains, dispersed through the provinces of Italy the praises of their heroic deliverer.
But Stilicho recognized that the empire had received a serious blow and that Alaric remained a considerable threat. He entered into secret negotiation with Alaric on the basis that Alaric would be less of a threat to the Republic if he were part of the Republic. From his camp near Emona in the confines of Italy, Alaric transmitted to the Emperor of the West a long account of promises, of expenses, and of demands, called for immediate satisfaction, and clearly intimated the consequences of a refusal. Yet, if his conduct was hostile, his language was decent and dutiful. He professed himself humbly the friend of Stilicho and the soldier of Honorius, and solicited, as a permanent retreat for the Gothic nation, the possession of some vacant province of the Western Empire.
Stilicho assembled the Senate in the palace of the Caesars, represented in a studied oration the actual state of affairs, proposed the demands of the Gothic king, and submitted to their consideration the choice of peace or war. The senators, as if they had been suddenly awakened from a dream of 400 years, appeared on this important occasion to be inspired by the courage rather than by the wisdom of their predecessors. They loudly declared, in regular speeches or in tumultuary acclamations, that it was unworthy of the majesty of Rome to purchase a precarious and disgraceful truce from a barbarian king, and that in the judgment of a magnanimous people, the chance of ruin was always preferable to the certainty of dishonor. The minister, whose pacific intentions were seconded only by the voices of a few servile and venal followers, attempted to allay the general ferment by an apology for his own conduct and even for the demands of the Gothic prince. The payment of a subsidy, which had excited the indignation of the Romans, ought not, such was the language of Stilicho, to be considered in the odious light either of a tribute or of a ransom extorted by the menaces of a barbarian enemy. Alaric had faithfully asserted the just pretensions of the Republic to the provinces which were usurped by the Greeks of Constantinople. He modestly required the fair and stipulated recompense of his services. And if he had desisted from the prosecution of his enterprise, he had obeyed in his retreat the peremptory though private letters of the emperor himself. These ostensible reasons were supported by the authority of Stilicho and obtained, after a warm debate, the reluctant approbation of the Senate. The tumult of virtue and freedom subsided, and the sum of 4,000 pounds of gold was granted, under the name of a subsidy, to secure the peace of Italy and to conciliate the friendship of the King of the Goths. Lampardius alone, one of the most illustrious members of the assembly, still persisted in his dissent. He exclaimed with a loud voice, "This is not a treaty of peace, but of servitude," and escaped the danger of such bold opposition by immediately retiring to the sanctuary of a Christian church. But the reign of Stilicho drew towards its end. and the proud minister might perceive the symptoms of his approaching disgrace. The generous boldness of Lampadius had been applauded, and the Senate, so patiently resigned to a long servitude, rejected with disdain the offer of invidious and imaginary freedom. The troops, who still assumed the name and prerogatives of the Roman legions, were exasperated by the partial affection of Stilicho for the barbarians, and the people imputed to the mischievous policy of the minister the public misfortunes which were the natural consequence of their own degeneracy. Yet Stilicho might have continued to brave the clamours of the people and even of the soldiers, if he could have maintained his dominion over the feeble mind of his pupil. But the respectful attachment of Honorius was converted into fear, suspicion, and hatred.
Honorius arranged a massacre of several of Stilicho's closest supporters. Stilicho himself escaped, but was swiftly captured and beheaded on the instructions of the emperor.
The servile crowd of the palace, who had so long adored the fortune of Stilicho, affected to insult his fall, and the most distant connection with the Master General of the West, which had so lately been a title to wealth and honours, was studiously denied and rigorously punished. His family, united by a triple alliance with the family of Theodosius, might envy the condition of the meanest peasant. The flight of his son Eucharius was intercepted, and the death of that innocent youth soon followed the divorce of Thermantia, who filled the palace of her sister Maria, and who, like Maria, had remained a virgin in the imperial bed. The friends of Stilicho, who had escaped the massacre of Pavia, were persecuted by the implacable revenge of Olympius, and the most exquisite cruelty was employed to extort the confession of a treasonable and sacrilegious conspiracy. They died in silence. Their firmness justified the choice, and perhaps absolved the innocence of their patron. And the despotic power which could take his life without a trial and stigmatize his memory without a proof has no jurisdiction over the impartial suffrage of posterity. The services of Stilicho are great and manifest. His crimes, as they are vaguely stated in the language of flattery and hatred, are obscure at least and improbable. About 4 months after his death, an edict was published in the name of Honorius to restore the free communication of the two empires, which had been so long interrupted by the public enemy. The minister, whose fame and fortune depended on the prosperity of the state, was accused of betraying Italy to the barbarians, whom he repeatedly vanquished. The foreign auxiliaries who had been attached to the person of Stilicho lamented his death. But the desire of revenge was checked by a natural apprehension for the safety of their wives and children, who were detained as hostages in the strong cities of Italy, where they had likewise deposited their most valuable effects. At the same hour, and as if by a common signal, the cities of Italy were polluted by the same horrid scenes of universal massacre and pillage, which involved, in promiscuous destruction, the families and fortunes of the barbarians. Exasperated by such an injury, which might have awakened the tamest and most servile spirit, they cast a look of indignation and hope towards the camp of Alaric, and unanimously swore to pursue with just and implacable war the perfidious nation that had so basely violated the laws of hospitality. By the imprudent conduct of the ministers of Honorius, the Republic lost the assistance and deserved the enmity of 30,000 of her bravest soldiers, and the weight of that formidable army, which alone might have determined the event of the war, was transferred from the scale of the Romans into that of the Goths. In the arts of negotiation, as well as in those of war, the Gothic king maintained his superior ascendant over an enemy whose seeming changes proceeded from the total want of counsel and design. From his camp on the confines of Italy, Alaric attentively observed the revolutions of the palace, watched the progress of faction and discontent, disguised the hostile aspect of a barbarian invader, and assumed the more popular appearance of the friend and ally of the great Stilicho, to whose virtues, when they were no longer formidable, he could pay a just tribute of sincere praise and regret. The pressing invitation of the malcontents, who urged the king of the Goths to invade Italy, was enforced by a lively sense of his personal injuries, and he might speciously complain that the imperial ministers still delayed and eluded the payment of the 4,000 pounds of gold which had been granted by the Roman Senate either to reward his services or to appease his fury. His decent firmness was supported by an artful moderation, which contributed to the success of his designs. He required a fair and reasonable satisfaction, but he gave the strongest assurances that, as soon as he had obtained it, he would immediately retire. He refused to trust the faith of the Romans unless Aetius and Jason, the sons of two great officers of state, were sent as hostages to his camp. But he offered to deliver in exchange several of the noblest youths of the Gothic nation.
Alaric's offer of peace was spurned. He marched into Italy, bypassing Ravenna, where the cowardly Honorius had removed himself and his entourage, and headed for Rome. As Gibbon relates, during a period of 619 years, the seat of empire had never been violated by the presence of a foreign enemy. That was soon to change.
The meanest Roman could purchase with a small copper coin the daily enjoyment of a scene of pomp and luxury which might excite the envy of the kings of Asia. From these stately palaces issued a swarm of dirty and ragged plebeians, without shoes and without a mantle, who loitered away whole days in the street or forum to hear news and to hold disputes, who dissipated in extravagant gaming the miserable pittance of their wives and children, and spent the hours of the night in obscure taverns and brothels in the indulgence of gross and vulgar sensuality. But the most lively and splendid amusement of the idle multitude depended on the frequent exhibition of public games and spectacles. The piety of Christian princes had suppressed the inhuman combats of gladiators, but the Roman people still considered the circus as their home, their temple, and the seat of the Republic. The impatient crowd rushed at the dawn of day to secure their places, and there were many who passed a sleepless and anxious night in the adjacent porticos. From the morning to the evening, careless of the sun or of the rain, the spectators, who sometimes amounted to the number of 400,000, remained in eager attention, their eyes fixed on the horses and charioteers, their minds agitated with hope and fear for the success of the colours which they espoused, and the happiness of Rome appeared to hang on the event of a race. The same immoderate ardour inspired their clamours and their applause as often as they were entertained with the hunting of wild beasts and the various modes of theatrical representation. These representations in modern capitals may deserve to be considered as a pure and elegant school of taste, and perhaps of virtue. But the tragic and comic muse of the Romans, who seldom aspired beyond the imitation of Attic genius, had been almost totally silent since the fall of the Republic, and their place was unworthily occupied by licentious farce, effeminate music, and splendid pageantry. The pantomimes, who maintained their reputation from the age of Augustus to the 6th century, expressed, without the use of words, the various fables of the gods and heroes of antiquity, and the perfection of their art, which sometimes disarmed the gravity of the philosopher, always excited the applause and wonder of the people. The vast and magnificent theatres of Rome were filled by 3,000 female dancers and by 3,000 singers, with the masters of the respective choruses. Such was the popular favour which they enjoyed, that in a time of scarcity, when all strangers were banished from the city, the merit of contributing to the public pleasures exempted them from a law which was strictly executed against the professors of the liberal arts. Such was the state of Rome under the reign of Honorius, at the time when the Gothic army formed the siege, or rather the blockade of the city. By a skilful disposition of his numerous forces, who impatiently watched the moment of an assault, Alaric encompassed the walls, commanded the 12 principal gates, intercepted all communication with the adjacent country, and vigilantly guarded the navigation of the Tiber, from which the Romans derived the surest and most plentiful supply of provisions. The first emotions of the nobles and of the people were those of surprise and indignation that a vile barbarian should dare to insult the capital of the world. But their arrogance was soon humbled by misfortune. That unfortunate city gradually experienced the distress of scarcity, and at length the horrid calamities of famine. The daily allowance of 3 pounds of bread was reduced to 1/2, to 1/3, to nothing, and the price of corn still continued to rise in a rapid and extravagant proportion. The food, the most repugnant to sense or imagination, the aliments, the most unwholesome and pernicious to the constitution, were eagerly devoured and fiercely disputed by the rage of hunger. A dark suspicion was entertained that some desperate wretches fed on the bodies of their fellow creatures whom they had secretly murdered. And even mothers, such was the horrid conflict of the two most powerful instincts implanted by nature in the human breast, even mothers are said to have tasted the flesh of their slaughtered infants. Many thousands of the inhabitants of Rome expired in their houses or in the streets for want of sustenance. And as the public sepulchres without the walls were in the power of the enemy, the stench which arose from so many putrid and unburied carcasses infected the air, and the miseries of famine were succeeded and aggravated by the contagion of a pestilential disease. The assurances of speedy and effectual relief, which were repeatedly transmitted from the court of Ravenna, supported for some time the fainting resolution of the Romans, till at length the despair of any human aid tempted them to accept the offers of a preternatural deliverance. Pompeianus, prefect of the city, had been persuaded by the art or fanaticism of some Tuscan diviners that by the mysterious force of spells and sacrifices they could extract the lightning from the clouds and point those celestial fires against the camp of the barbarians. The important secret was communicated to Innocent, the Bishop of Rome, and the successor of St. Peter is accused, perhaps without foundation, of preferring the safety of the Republic to the rigid severity of the Christian worship. But when the question was agitated in the Senate, when it was proposed as an essential condition that those sacrifices should be performed in the Capitol, by the authority and in the presence of the magistrates, the majority of that respectable assembly, apprehensive either of the divine or of the imperial displeasure, refused to join in an act which appeared almost equivalent to the public restoration of paganism. The last resource of the Romans was in the clemency, or at least in the moderation, of the King of the Goths. The Senate, who in this emergency assumed the supreme powers of government, appointed 2 ambassadors to negotiate with the enemy. This important trust was delegated to Basilius, a senator of Spanish extraction and already conspicuous in the administration of provinces, and to John, the first tribune of the notaries, who was peculiarly qualified by his dexterity in business as well as by his former intimacy with the Gothic prince. When they were introduced into his presence, they declared, perhaps in a more lofty style than became their abject condition, that the Romans were resolved to maintain their dignity either in peace or war, and that if Alaric refused them a fair and honourable capitulation, he might sound his trumpets and prepare to give battle to an innumerable people exercised in arms and animated by despair. The thicker the hay, the easier it is mowed, was the concise reply of the barbarian, and this rustic metaphor was accompanied by a loud and insulting laugh, expressive of his contempt for the menaces of an unwarlike populace, enervated by luxury before they were emaciated by famine. He then condescended to fix the ransom which he would accept as the price of his retreat from the walls of Rome. All the gold and silver in the city, whether it were the property of the state or of individuals, all the rich and precious movables, and all the slaves who could prove their title to the name of barbarians. The ministers of the Senate presumed to ask, in a modest and suppliant tone, "If such, O king, are your demands, what do you intend to leave us?" "Your lives," replied the haughty conqueror. They trembled and retired.
At that the coffers of the Roman treasury opened with alacrity, and Alaric lifted the siege.
His army, enriched by the contributions of the capital, slowly advanced into the fair and fruitful province of Tuscany, where he proposed to establish his winter quarters, and the Gothic standard became the refuge of 40,000 barbarian slaves who had broke their chains and aspired, under the command of their great deliverer, to revenge the injuries and the disgrace of their cruel servitude. About the same time he received a more honourable reinforcement of Goths and Huns, whom Adolphus, the brother of his wife, had conducted at his pressing invitation from the banks of the Danube to those of the Tiber, and who had cut their way with some difficulty and loss through the superior numbers of the imperial troops. A victorious leader who united the daring spirit of a barbarian with the art and discipline of a Roman general was at the head of 100,000 fighting men, and Italy pronounced with terror and respect the formidable name of Alaric. The king of the Goths repeatedly declared that it was his desire to be considered as the friend of peace and of the Romans. 3 senators, at his earnest request, were sent ambassadors to the court of Ravenna to solicit the exchange of hostages and the conclusion of the treaty, and the proposals, which he more clearly expressed during the course of the negotiations, could only inspire a doubt of his sincerity, as they might seem inadequate to the state of his fortune. The barbarian still aspired to the rank of Master General of the armies of the West. He stipulated an annual subsidy of corn and money, and he chose the provinces of Dalmatia, Noricum, and Venetia for the seat of his new kingdom, which would have commanded the important communication between Italy and the Danube. If these modest terms should be rejected, Alaric showed a disposition to relinquish his pecuniary demands, and even to content himself with the possession of Noricum, an exhausted and impoverished country, perpetually exposed to the inroads of the barbarians of Germany. But the hopes of peace were disappointed by the weak obstinacy or interested views of the minister Olympius. Without listening to the salutary remonstrances of the Senate, he dismissed their ambassadors under the conduct of a military escort, too numerous for a retinue of honour, and too feeble for an army of defence. While the emperor and his court enjoyed with sullen pride the security of the marshes and fortifications of Ravenna, they abandoned Rome, almost without defence, to the resentment of Alaric. The king of the Goths, who no longer dissembled his appetite for plunder and revenge, appeared in arms under the walls of the capital, and the trembling Senate, without any hopes of relief, prepared, by a desperate resistance, to delay the ruin of their country. But they were unable to guard against the secret conspiracy of their slaves and domestics, who either from birth or interest were attached to the cause of the enemy. At the hour of midnight, the Salarian gate was silently opened, and the inhabitants were awakened by the tremendous sound of the Gothic trumpet. 1163 years after the foundation of Rome, the imperial city, which had subdued and civilized so considerable a part of mankind, was delivered to the licentious fury of the tribes of Germany and Scythia. The proclamation of Alaric, when he forced his entrance into a vanquished city, discovered, however, some regard for the laws of humanity and religion. He encouraged his troops boldly to seize the rewards of valour, and to enrich themselves with the spoils of a wealthy and effeminate people. But he exhorted them at the same time to spare the lives of the unresisting citizens, and to respect the churches of the Apostles St. Peter and St. Paul as holy and inviolable sanctuaries. Amidst the horrors of a nocturnal tumult, several of the Christian Goths displayed the fervour of a recent conversion, and some instances of their uncommon piety and moderation are related, and perhaps adorned, by the zeal of ecclesiastical writers. But the holy precincts of the Vatican and the apostolic churches could receive a very small proportion of the Roman people. Many thousand warriors, more especially of the Huns who served under the standard of Alaric, were strangers to the name, or at least to the faith, of Christ, and we may suspect, without any breach of charity or candour, that in the hour of savage license, when every passion was inflamed and every restraint was removed, the precepts of the gospel seldom influenced the behaviour of the Gothic Christians. The writers the best disposed to exaggerate their clemency have freely confessed that a cruel slaughter was made of the Romans, and that the streets of the city were filled with dead bodies, which remained without burial during the general consternation. The despair of the citizens was sometimes converted into fury, and whenever the barbarians were provoked by opposition, they extended the promiscuous massacre to the feeble, the innocent, and the helpless. The private revenge of 40,000 slaves was exercised without pity or remorse, and the ignominious lashes which they had formerly received were washed away in the blood of the guilty or obnoxious families. The matrons and virgins of Rome were exposed to injuries more dreadful in the apprehension of chastity than death itself, and the ecclesiastical historian has selected an example of female virtue for the admiration of future ages. A Roman lady of singular beauty and orthodox faith had excited the impatient desires of a young Goth, who, according to the sagacious remark of Sozomen, was attached to the Arian heresy. Exasperated by her obstinate resistance, he drew his sword, and with the anger of a lover, slightly wounded her neck. The bleeding heroine still continued to brave his resentment and to repel his love, till the ravisher desisted from his unavailing efforts, respectfully conducted her to the sanctuary of the Vatican, and gave 6 pieces of gold to the guards of the church on condition that they should restore her inviolate to the arms of her husband. Such instances of courage and generosity were not extremely common. The brutal soldiers satisfied their sensual appetites without consulting either the inclination or the duties of their female captives. And a nice question of casuistry was seriously agitated, whether those tender victims who had inflexibly refused their consent to the violation which they sustained had lost, by their misfortune, the glorious crown of virginity. There were other losses indeed of a more substantial kind and more general concern. It cannot be presumed that all the barbarians were at all times capable of perpetrating such amorous outrages, and the want of youth, or beauty, or chastity protected the greatest part of the Roman women from the danger of a rape. But avarice is an insatiate and universal passion, since the enjoyment of almost every object that can afford pleasure to the different tastes and tempers of mankind may be procured by the possession of wealth. In the pillage of Rome, a just preference was given to gold and jewels, which contain the greatest value in the smallest compass and weight. But after these portable riches had been removed by the more diligent robbers, the palaces of Rome were rudely stripped of their splendid and costly furniture. The sideboards of massy plate and the variegated wardrobes of silk and purple were irregularly piled in the wagons that always followed the march of a Gothic army.
After 6 days, the Goths left Rome. Alaric proceeded to plunder other parts of Italy, and Rome gradually recovered some of its former glory. As Gibbon notes, the vestiges of the Gothic invasion were almost obliterated in less than 7 years. But the Roman Empire as such no longer existed by the beginning of the 5th century. In Gaul, Italy, Spain, all of the Western Empire save Africa, and that only briefly, the barbarian hordes had triumphed. Britain rebelled, unchallenged, and set up its own governing class. The Eastern Empire was no longer Roman in any meaningful sense of the word, but was ruled by tyrants who derived their ancestry from the very barbarians Rome once despised. After Alaric sacked Rome, the Emperor Marcian, who ruled the East between AD 450 and AD 457, bravely refused to pay Attila the Hun the annual tribute demanded by this latest barbarian victor. Attila's response was to invade Gaul and Italy and take what he pleased. In AD 455, the Western Empire was ruled by the Emperor Petronius Maximus for 3 months. Genseric, king of the Vandals, yet another barbarian race, sailed his navy to the mouth of the Tiber, disembarked, and with impunity marched to the gates of Rome, wherein Maximus had already been stoned to death and cast into the same Tiber. Genseric looted the city for 14 days. Between then and the accession of Odoacer, the first barbarian king of Italy, before AD 500, 9 emperors came and went without distinguishing themselves.
Odoacer was the first barbarian who reigned in Italy over a people who had once asserted their just superiority above the rest of mankind. The disgrace of the Romans still excites our respectful compassion, and we fondly sympathize with the imaginary grief and indignation of their degenerate posterity. But the calamities of Italy had gradually subdued the proud consciousness of freedom and glory. In the age of Roman virtue, the provinces were subject to the arms and the citizens to the laws of the Republic, till those laws were subverted by civil discord, and both the city and the provinces became the servile property of a tyrant. The forms of the constitution which alleviated or disguised their abject slavery were abolished by time and violence. The Italians alternately lamented the presence or the absence of the sovereigns whom they detested or despised. And the succession of 5 centuries inflicted the various evils of military license, capricious despotism, and elaborate oppression. During the same period, the barbarians had emerged from obscurity and contempt, and the warriors of Germany and Scythia were introduced into the provinces as the servants, the allies, and at length the masters of the Romans, whom they insulted or protected. Their hatred of the people was suppressed by fear. They respected the spirit and splendor of the martial chiefs who were invested with the honors of the empire, and the fate of Rome had long depended on the sword of those formidable strangers. The King of Italy was not unworthy of the high station to which his valor and fortune had exalted him. His savage manners were polished by the habits of conversation, and he respected, though a conqueror and a barbarian, the institutions and even the prejudices of his subjects. After an interval of 7 years, Odoacer restored the consulship of the West. For himself, he modestly or proudly declined an honor which was still accepted by the emperors of the East. But the curule chair was successfully filled by 11 of the most illustrious senators, and the list is adorned by the respectable name of Basilius, whose virtues claimed the friendship and grateful applause of Sidonius, his client. The laws of the emperors were strictly enforced, and the civil administration of Italy was still exercised by the praetorian prefect and his subordinate officers. Odoacer devolved on the Roman magistrates the odious and oppressive task of collecting the public revenue, but he reserved for himself the merit of seasonable and popular indulgence. He revered the monastic and episcopal characters, and the silence of the Catholics attests the toleration which they enjoyed. The peace of the city required the interposition of his prefect Basilius in the choice of a Roman pontiff. The decree which restrained the clergy from alienating their lands was ultimately designed for the benefit of the people, whose devotion would have been taxed to repair the dilapidations of the church. Italy was protected by the arms of its conqueror, and its frontiers were respected by the barbarians of Gaul and Germany, who had so long insulted the feeble race of Theodosius. Odoacer passed the Hadriatic to chastise the assassins of the Emperor Nippos, and to acquire the maritime province of Dalmatia. He passed the Alps to rescue the remains of Noricum from Fava or Feletheus, king of the Rugians, who held his residence beyond the Danube. The king was vanquished in battle and led away prisoner. A numerous colony of captives and subjects was transplanted into Italy, and Rome, after a long period of defeat and disgrace, might claim the triumph of her barbarian master. Notwithstanding the prudence and success of Odoacer, his kingdom exhibited the sad prospect of misery and desolation. Since the age of Tiberius, the decay of agriculture had been felt in Italy, and it was a just subject of complaint that the life of the Roman people depended on the accidents of the winds and waves. In the division and the decline of the empire, the tributary harvests of Egypt and Africa were withdrawn. The numbers of the inhabitants continually diminished with the means of subsistence, and the country was exhausted by the irretrievable losses of war, famine, and pestilence. St. Ambrose has deplored the ruin of a populous district which had been once adorned with the flourishing cities of Bologna, Modena, Rhegium, and Placentia. Pope Gelasius was a subject of Odoacer, and he affirms, with strong exaggeration, that in Emilia, Tuscany, and the adjacent provinces, the human species was almost extirpated. The plebeians of Rome, who were fed by the hand of their master, perished or disappeared as soon as his liberality was suppressed. The decline of the arts reduced the industrious mechanic to idleness and want, and the senators, who might support with patience the ruin of their country, bewailed their private loss of wealth and luxury. 1/3 of those ample estates, to which the ruin of Italy is originally imputed, was extorted for the use of the conquerors. Injuries were aggravated by insults. The sense of actual sufferings was embittered by the fear of more dreadful evils. And as new lands were allotted to new swarms of barbarians, each senator was apprehensive lest the arbitrary surveyors should approach his favourite villa or his most profitable farm. The least unfortunate were those who submitted without a murmur to the power which it was impossible to resist. Since they desired to live, they owed some gratitude to the tyrant who had spared their lives. And since he was the absolute master of their fortunes, the portion which he left must be accepted as his pure and voluntary gift. The distress of Italy was mitigated by the prudence and humanity of Odoacer, who had bound himself, as the price of his elevation, to satisfy the demands of a licentious and turbulent multitude. After a reign of 14 years, Odoacer was oppressed by the superior genius of Theodoric, king of the Ostrogoths, a hero alike excellent in the arts of war and of government, who restored an age of peace and prosperity, and whose name still excites and deserves the attention of mankind.
Thus does Gibbon bring to an end his third volume, the concluding days of the Roman Empire being spent with profound irony under the control of precisely those foes whom the Roman legions had forced once to kneel before the imperial purple. But before ending, we should pass to Volume 4, where, in the midst of describing the Eastern Republic's development, Gibbon steps back and offers some general observations on the fall of the Roman Empire in the West.
The fidelity of the citizens to each other and to the state was confirmed by the habits of education and the prejudices of religion. Honor, as well as virtue, was the principle of the Republic. The ambitious citizens labored to deserve the solemn glories of a triumph, and the ardor of the Roman youth was kindled into active emulation as often as they beheld the domestic images of their ancestors. The temperate struggles of the patricians and plebeians had finally established the firm and equal balance of the constitution, which united the freedom of popular assemblies with the authority and wisdom of a senate and the executive powers of a regal magistrate. When the consul displayed the standard of the Republic, each citizen bound himself by the obligation of an oath to draw his sword in the cause of his country, till he had discharged the sacred duty by a military service of 10 years. The rise of a city which swelled into an empire may deserve, as a singular prodigy, the reflection of a philosophic mind. But the decline of Rome was the natural and inevitable effect of immoderate greatness. Prosperity ripened the principle of decay. The causes of destruction multiplied with the extent of conquest. And as soon as time or accident had removed the artificial supports, the stupendous fabric yielded to the pressure of its own weight. The story of its ruin is simple and obvious, and instead of inquiring why the Roman Empire was destroyed, we should rather be surprised that it had subsisted so long. The victorious legions, who in distant wars acquired the vices of strangers and mercenaries, first oppressed the freedom of the Republic, and afterwards violated the majesty of the purple. The emperors, anxious for their personal safety and the public peace, were reduced to the base expedient of corrupting the discipline which rendered them alike formidable to their sovereign and to the enemy. The vigor of the military government was relaxed and finally dissolved by the partial institutions of Constantine, and the Roman world was overwhelmed by a deluge of barbarians. As the happiness of a future life is the great object of religion, we may hear without surprise that the introduction, or at least the abuse, of Christianity had some influence on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. The clergy successfully preached the doctrines of patience and pusillanimity. The active virtues of society were discouraged, and the last remains of military spirit were buried in the cloister. A large portion of public and private wealth was consecrated to the specious demands of charity and devotion, and the soldiers' pay was lavished on the useless multitudes of both sexes, who could only plead the merits of abstinence and chastity. Faith, zeal, curiosity, and more earthly passions of malice and ambition kindled the flame of theological discord. The church and even the state were distracted by religious factions whose conflicts were sometimes bloody and always implacable. The attention of the emperors was diverted from camps to synods. The Roman world was oppressed by a new species of tyranny, and the persecuted sects became the secret enemies of their country. Yet party spirit, however pernicious or absurd, is a principle of union as well as of dissension. The bishops, from 1800 pulpits, inculcated the duty of passive obedience to a lawful and orthodox sovereign. Their frequent assemblies and perpetual correspondence maintained the communion of distant churches, and the benevolent temper of the gospel was strengthened, though confined, by the spiritual alliance of the Catholics. The sacred indolence of the monks was devoutly embraced by a servile and effeminate age. But if superstition had not afforded a decent retreat, the same vices would have tempted the unworthy Romans to desert, from baser motives, the standard of the Republic. Cold, poverty, and a life of danger and fatigue fortify the strength and courage of barbarians. In every age they have oppressed the polite and peaceful nations of China, India, and Persia, who neglected, and still neglect, to counterbalance these natural powers by the resources of military art. The warlike states of antiquity, Greece, Macedonia, and Rome, educated a race of soldiers, exercised their bodies, disciplined their courage, multiplied their forces by regular evolutions, and converted the iron which they possessed into strong and serviceable weapons. But this superiority insensibly declined with their laws and manners, and the feeble policy of Constantine and his successors armed and instructed for the ruin of the empire the rude valor of the barbarian mercenaries. Ages of laborious ascent have been followed by a moment of rapid downfall, and the several climates of the globe have felt the vicissitudes of light and darkness. Yet the experience of 4,000 years should enlarge our hopes and diminish our apprehensions. We cannot determine to what height the human species may aspire in their advance towards perfection, but it may safely be presumed that no people, unless the face of nature is changed, will relapse into their original barbarism.